everybody. So I've been seeing on social media that a lot of my friends are starting to experiment with natural yeast or sourdough yeast. They're basically the same thing. And I think that this is great. I've had my sourdough starter for over 3 years. I started him in January of 2017 when I taught my history of food course for the first time. And there multiple different ways to start a sourdough starter, and I can do a video about that later on, but mine just used flour, water, and wheat berries, which are essentially the whole wheat grain. And I let that sit in my office at work for a week or so, and I fed it and I took care of it, and it became a viable starter. And this is what he looks like. So this is my starter, and I will also post a picture of him right here so you can see him more close up, but he is really robust now. He smells very potent. He has baked me a lot of bread, and I store him in the fridge at this point and only feed him about once a week, so I'll also have a video about how I feed him and take care of him. The nice thing about having an older starter is that they're much more resilient, and so I can actually go 2 or 3 weeks without feeding him if he's in the fridge, and I can revive him. So what this video about though is how to bake bread using a sourdough starter. It is not an exact conversion between active yeast, so powdered yeast essentially that you buy at the store, and sourdough yeast. Active yeast is kind of hyperactive, and it produces a lot of carbon dioxide, and so you get a lot of bubbles and a lot of air pockets, but it doesn't digest in the same way. Sourdough yeast takes much longer to ferment, and it actually digests some of the bread, and so it becomes a very different type of bread using this natural yeast. So I made bread here. I made 2 loaves. This is one that I'm going to give away to somebody, and I will post pictures at the end of what the final bread looked like. But I hope that this video is useful for you and will help you feel more comfortable baking with natural yeast. The first thing I do before I start baking bread is I feed and revive my starter, which is what I'm doing here. And by the way, my starter is named Sir Frederick Breddington III. My students named him, or Sir Freddie Breddy to his friends. And I do this 4 to 6 hours before I start baking, so my yeasts are very active. I tamp down the sleepy starter to get out the bubbles, which is what you just saw, and I add equal parts by weight of filtered water and flour. And there are other recipes that include fruit juice or sugar, but I find that flour and water work best for me. So I like mixing the water into the starter in the jar because it is less messy, and then I pour the whole thing into the bowl and then add the flour. And it also gives me the opportunity to get a clean jar for Sir Freddie so he stays healthy. So you can use any kind of flour to feed your starter, but I generally use whole wheat flour, which is what this is. And you can also switch it up. If you have a whole wheat starter, you can add bread flour to it depending on what you're using to bake. So I mix the bowl until it becomes a thick paste. This is a little thinner than I normally like, but you know, it doesn't matter all that much. And then after I kind of scrape everything together, I use a cheap plastic shower cap to cover it up, and I let it sit for 4 to 6 hours, and you can tell when it's ready because it's kind of bubbly and fluffy like this. And at this point, I'm ready to make dough. To measure out the starter, I put the water into a measuring cup, and then I add the starter to the water, and this makes it so much easier to measure this kind of gelatinous, goopy mixture. For my simple bread recipe, I use 2 cups of filtered water, 2 cups of starter, 2 teaspoons of salt, and 5 to 6 cups of flour. And I usually use a mixture of bread and whole wheat flours. I also add a dollop of honey and 2 tablespoons of ground flax seeds for flavor and omega-3s. And as you see here, I have a stand mixer, so I start in there with a dough hook, but you can mix it in a bowl and then knead by hand, which is, you know, very satisfying. And here I'm adding the honey first. The sugars in the honey get the yeasts all kind of excited and activated, and I mix that for a bit. And then I'm ready to add flour, which I add in 2-cup increments. So this is 2 cups of whole wheat flour, 2 tablespoons of the flax seeds, and I set that on my mixer, and that just kind of goes until it becomes a bit of a goopy mess. 2 cups of flour in this amount of water is actually not very much. And I add again another 2 cups of flour, and in this case I'm adding bread flour. And this is also when I add the 2 teaspoons of salt. And I don't add that right away because salt actually kills yeast, and so you want the salt to have kind of a buffer between it and the yeast. And so that first layer of whole wheat flour allows the salt and yeast to not interact as much. And at this point, you want to add 1 to 2 cups more flour in kind of 1/2 cup to 1 cup increments until you get the right consistency. This here is much too wet. It's still kind of goopy. You want your dough to be thick enough that it clears the side of the bowl as it spins like this. And once it's that consistency, I usually let it knead itself in the mixer for 5 to 8 minutes. At this point, I will turn to hand kneading, and I do that on this slab. I start the hand kneading process by flouring my slab and then pulling the dough onto the slab. And I generally knead for about 5 minutes after it had been in the mixer for 5 minutes. If I decide I want to knead the whole time and not mix it in the mixer, I'll probably knead it for 15 minutes. So it takes a good amount of time to get the gluten to build up. And so you just basically flour your hands and go to town. And there are all different ways to knead depending on the surface and depending on how wet or dry the dough is. But my method is either a kind of rolling method or a slapping and stretching method, but you basically need to find the kneading method that works for you. And like I said, with the mixer I do it for 5 minutes. Without the mixer I do it for about 15 minutes. And as you can see, after about 5 minutes, the dough is pretty pliable and stretchy. It has a really nice feeling, and I check to see how stretchy it is if it breaks, and that looks pretty good to me. So I give it kind of 1 more flour and pat, and I roll it into a nice little ball. And I take a big bowl that I grease with olive oil, which I'm going to do here, and I put it in that bowl to rise basically on the counter for usually 8 to 10 hours. I like doing this in the evening, and by morning I have a nicely risen dough. In general, sourdough wants to be about 70 degrees. So depending on where you vary from that temperature, that'll tell you whether you need more or less time. And as with the starter, I cover it with a shower cap and I let it sit. And this is what the dough looked like after about 12 hours. Now, I want to give a disclaimer. I actually punched it down ahead of time, and then it rose for another like 6 to 8 hours after I punched it down. I made the dough earlier in the afternoon than I normally do, and so it's a little overproofed at this point. But I'm still going to make the bread. I flour the slab, I turn it out onto the floured slab, and I give it a good, mix. And you can see that it's very stretchy, and it's very bubbly, and it's like really well impregnated with the yeast, which is what you want. And so here I'm just kind of mixing it all together again to make sure that it's that it's ready. And I turn it into a tube, and I make 2 loaves of sandwich bread out of this recipe. So I cut it in half, I have 2 separate loaves, and I form them into smaller cylinders that I then put in to lined bread tins, which you will see in a minute. And here is my parchment lined bread tin into which I put the bread. Lining it just makes it easier to pull out when it's done baking. And I cover it again with my cheapo shower caps, and I set it on the counter and I let it rise for about 1 to 1.5 hours. And I do the same thing with this one right here. So now I have my 2 covered loaves that I let sit for, well, I should have let sit for an hour to an hour and a half. As I talk about later, I actually proved them for a bit longer than they should have been. And as you see here, they are well risen, but the one on the right actually has slashes in it. I did a little experiment and I slashed it before it rose. The one on the left, I didn't slash at all, and so it looks kind of like busted through. And these are both overproved, which means that they rose up and flattened, which I'll explain a bit more later. But overall, they had a good rise, and they ended up being pretty okay. So for the second rise, I let them rise for about 4 hours. They are a little overproved. The first rise was too much, and the second rise was too much. And what happens with natural yeast when it rises, when it's overproved, is that it kind of flattens out a bit, which is why the bread is a little bit flat. I definitely could have popped it in the oven sooner, but I was in the middle of something and so couldn't at that point. But I baked these loaves at 350 for about 40 minutes, and I took them out and I let them cool before I cut them up. So this is essentially how I bake my bread every week. And this recipe makes 2 sandwich tin loaves. I feed my starter whenever I bake with him. And so I'll feed him in the lead up to baking, and then after I've baked everything, I take the remainder and I feed it again and I put him back in the fridge. So he kind of becomes really active during the baking, and then he's dormant during the week, and then I activate him again. That's it for me over here in Mississippi, and I hope that this was helpful for you.